send the Russian economy into reverse just about immediately.
Over a year ago, Putin launched the largest European land war since World War II. Despite his inability to secure a quick victory, and despite Russia being slapped with the most comprehensive sanctions imposed on a major power in nearly a century, the Russian economy has defied all odds and exceeded even the most optimistic predictions. While the rest of the world expected Russia to be crippled, the economy only shrunk by a measly 2.1%. Even more shockingly, it is expected to return to growth this year, and could even outpace the United Kingdom and Germany. Inflation did increase, but it wasn't as dramatic compared to the European Union when taking into account historical trends. Meanwhile, unemployment is at an all-time low. The Russian currency, the ruble, took a huge hit initially, but quickly bounced back to 8-year highs just months after the invasion began. To top it all off, in 2022, Russia has experienced its largest inflow of revenue and its largest trade surplus since its formation from the ashes of the communist Soviet Union. This financial support has given Putin all the resources he needs to continue fueling his bloody military conquest, despite the Western world conducting what amounts to a full-scale economic war in response. It's hard to fathom how Russia's economy has not only survived, but seemingly thrived amidst the turmoil. Some wonder if Putin has crafted a blueprint for other nations with territorial aspirations to follow, or if this is all just an economic mirage that will soon fade away. Yet the roots of this issue dates back well before conflict in Ukraine, well before Putin came to power, and well before the Russian state we know of today even existed. Russia's ability to stave off collapse and continue fighting today and in the future lay not in the current state of affairs, but embedded within the fundamental traits it inherited from the Soviet Union, the precarious path of reform in which it developed, and the delicate political economy Putin has carefully crafted over the last 22 years. After all, armed conflicts are frequently determined by economic power, while the intricate interplay between history and politics plays a crucial role in shaping a nation's economy and how it responds in times of crisis. So what exactly is going on? Why has Russia's economy not collapsed? By the late 1960s, the Soviet Union found itself in a precarious situation. Despite decades of impressive economic growth, which in just 40 years had transformed the country from a backwards agricultural society into an industrial behemoth, capable of defeating Germany in World War II and launching the first man and satellite into space, the economy was beginning to stagnate. The government, led by a totalitarian communist regime in which all industry, every price for every good, every salary, and the exact input and outputs of materials and goods was set by the state, proved wildly successful in growing the economy by simply shifting millions of peasants from inefficient farming communities to highly productive heavy industries. However, once the citizens were already working in factories, the system proved incapable of squeezing out extra productivity from them. This stemmed from an underlying lack of incentives for citizens to work harder, more efficiently, or to innovate. After all, why do more if you wouldn't be paid more, and if it was nearly impossible to be fired? While later reforms tried to implement wage scales to improve incentives, when workers went to buy goods, they often could not do so, as shortages came to define the Soviet system, while variety and quality of goods remained subpar. The fundamental reforms that would have improved the productivity of the economy never came to fruition, as it would have necessitated a diminishment of government power and thus would have risked toppling the entire regime. Instead, the government embarked on a gargantuan plan to develop the Soviet Union's vast and inhospitable Siberian and Arctic regions. Tens of millions of people would be forced to build new infrastructure, erect new towns and cities from nothing, and eventually to man the many new mines and, most critically, the sprawling new gas and oil fields. Despite the heavy cost of doing so, this proved to be highly profitable, and it could not have come at a more opportune time. As war broke out in the Middle East, leading the major oil-producing nations to embargo the Western world, the first oil crisis saw the global price of energy skyrocket by 6-fold over just 7 years. The Soviet Union, now selling its vast supply of oil to its capitalist rivals, quickly became flooded in money and spurred on further expansion of its oil production capabilities. By the 1980s, it was now the largest producer of oil in the world, and every year, hundreds of billions of dollars started pouring in. This revenue enabled the Soviet Union to do four very important things. The first was it allowed for large imports of food and consumer goods to satisfy a population becoming ever more envious of their Western European counterparts. The second was that it was able to continue financing its enormous military. Thirdly, it used its own oil production to massively subsidize its inefficient industries by artificially dropping the cost of energy at 95% less than the global average. Yet most importantly, the Soviet leaders used its oil revenues to import advanced Western machinery and equipment, in the hopes that this would boost the productivity base of its factories, which in turn would revive economic growth. In essence, the Soviet Union was using oil exports to patch up the fundamental flaws with its economy, but in the process, it became overly reliant upon a single resource. Yet even as this proved successful for a period of time, underlying productivity continued to erode, while its military burden grew larger as it struggled to keep up with the West and embarked on a costly invasion of Afghanistan. Meanwhile, its import bill continued to climb as the economy grew more complex and its citizens demanded better consumer goods. As a result, the economy entered a prolonged period that was referred to by its citizens as the Great Stagnation. All of these mounting pressures came to the forefront in 1986, when oil prices plummeted by nearly 70% due to Saudi Arabia dramatically increasing their own oil production. Soviet oil revenues, which it had been using to prop up the rest of the economy, plummeted by almost 75%. This all but forced new leader Mikhail Gorbachev to implement major new reforms. Yet these reforms proved too much for the system, as they led to a dramatic unraveling of the highly centralized state apparatus and the planned economy, eventually culminating in the collapse of the Soviet Union. Along with 14 other states, the Russian Federation was born from its ashes on Christmas Day 1991, with Boris Yeltsin as its leader. In the aftermath, reformers aspired to transform Russia into a typical Western nation, characterized by democratic values, a capitalist economy, and eventually elevated standards of living. However, achieving this feat was akin to mending a ship while it's already sailing in the middle of the ocean. Despite the horrific atrocities that occurred under the Soviet Union, the magnitude of suffering Russians would endure from its collapse cannot be overstated. Never mind it being the largest geopolitical and economic shift in human history, but all of a sudden, the highly controlled and intricate system that governed nearly every aspect of its citizens' lives disintegrated almost overnight. The Russian people were left in a state of uncertainty about what would come next, if they still had jobs, and if they would be able to buy food tomorrow. At the same time, its new leaders had to contend with building new institutions from scratch while grappling with impossible debt obligations, a catastrophic recession, hyperinflation, and the near total collapse of tax revenue. Not only did the state have almost no financial resources to work with, but it also had to contend with a huge number of separate political factions fighting for control over economic assets and political power. Many former Soviet insiders started spontaneously and illegally seizing factories for themselves, while other industries which employed millions fell idle due to the Soviets' complex supply chains and management structure simply ceasing to function. Amidst this backdrop, the reformers had three key goals: to institute a democratic political system that would replace the authoritarian one-party rule, build a new state identity from the ashes of the Soviet Union, and establish a capitalist economic system to replace the planned economy. In an effort to achieve all of this in a sort of shock therapy, they implemented savage cuts to government spending, from reducing the size and wages of military and police to cutting almost all subsidies to industries. This was hoped to not only balance the government's spending bill, but to also force the hugely inefficient Soviet industries to reorganize and reform to be profitable and more productive. To liberalize the economy, the government tore down barriers to international trade, legalized private businesses to be set up and trade freely, and dismantled price controls on some 90% of consumer goods. In theory, all of these rapid reforms would inflict necessary but temporary pain, ultimately leading to a better functioning economy. At the same time, the rapid decentralization of economic activity would reduce former Soviet elites' power, as they wanted nothing more than to retain the privileges they once enjoyed. In practice, the burden on the citizens was catastrophic. In the first month of price controls being lifted, inflation rose 225% and ultimately 2,000% from 1991 to 1995. Market stalls sprang up everywhere, stocked with never-before-seen Western goods, yet most couldn't afford them as decades of savings were wiped out instantly by inflation. The significant defunding of the police and military security apparatus gave rise to a giant wave of crime and violence, in which Russia would go on to have a similar homicide rate to cartel-ridden Mexico and Colombia. Giant industries no longer receiving subsidies started mass layoffs and/or failed to pay workers. Unemployment, once nearly 0%, albeit because of inefficient government mandates, rose to over 15%, which does not even capture those not being paid or forced to work part-time. In sum total, the entire economy contracted by 50%, which is double the decline experienced by the United States during the Great Depression. Millions of Russians fled the nation, while those that stayed stopped having as many children. Alcoholism rates, already high to begin with, became endemic, as life expectancy for men dropped to just 57 years, lower than it was in the 1950s under Joseph Stalin. But what truly scarred Russia's long-term economic outlook was the complete botched privatization of state-owned assets, as the problem of who should get what, coupled with a weak government, proved to just be too big of a problem to solve. After 74 years in which the state largely owned every single factory, every single business, and every single store, who exactly do you give ownership to? Initially, reformers came up with a plan to allow management and workers to buy shares in their place of work. At the same time, privatization vouchers were given to all citizens that could be used to get partial ownership in companies and/or be freely traded. Reformers branded this as the people's capitalism. Unfortunately, what really happened was far from it. Amid the economic and political chaos in a now weakened state, enterprise managers either just took the factories for themselves or forced their employees to give up their shares, while other large industries were given to powerful elites in return for political support or bribes. In the most high-profile case, amid Yeltsin being convinced that he would lose the upcoming election to the still influential Communist Party, he allowed the most powerful businessmen in the country to stake claim to Russia's largest and most profitable industries in return for support against the communists. Instantly, these businessmen became the richest and most influential people in all of Russia, if not the world. And with electoral fraud, Yeltsin barely retained the presidency in 1996. For the Russian people, this was hard to stomach. After decades of supposedly working for the common good in the most resource-rich nation on Earth, the vast majority of citizens had nothing to show for it, while a handful of men now controlled a vast portion of the riches. However, underlying reforms did start to show improvements to the system. A new flourishing class of entrepreneurs emerged. Inflation started to recede as production of pricey goods rose, chronic shortages came to an end, and many inefficient industries reorganized to become more efficient. However, this process was severely curtailed as the government started to roll back on certain reforms under mounting political and social pressure. In an effort to keep unemployment from rising any higher, credit and subsidies were rolled out to struggling industries. Not only did this embolden many industries to continue operating inefficiently as they did under the Soviet Union, but when combined with many enterprises proving adept at evading taxes, the government found itself unable to balance revenues and expenditures. To make up for the growing deficit, the government started issuing huge amounts of high-interest short-term bonds. Along with a costly and unpopular war to put down Chechen independence fighters, the government's debts started to grow rapidly. Then, in 1997, the Asian financial crisis quickly spread to developing countries and in the process plummeted oil prices. As a result, the government defaulted on its domestic debts, and private industries defaulted on their foreign debts. GDP and the ruble collapsed, and as confidence was lost in Russia's banking system, huge amounts of cash fled the country. By the end of the decade, despite Russians having lived through the atrocities of the Soviet Union, the 1990s proved for many to be the bleakest period of their lives. Russia was now dominated by big businesses that didn't pay taxes and abused legal and illegal methods to stomp down on small and emerging new companies. Corruption ran rampant among the now weakened government, while organized crime terrorized the Russian people. This, along with weak property rights and a poor business environment, kept investment at critically low levels as profits from businesses fled the country to buy luxury yachts and property in Europe or were hidden away in offshore bank accounts. As the new millennium and elections approached, the possibility of the communists returning to power loomed large, dimming hopes of economic reforms that would fix the country's economic woes. That quickly changed when a little-known ex-KGB agent named Vladimir Putin came along.